Andy Warhol is considered by many to be one of the most important artists of the 20th century. Though critics and artists continue to debate the meaning of his work, few question its impact on contemporary art. This influence is the subject of an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It is called Regarding Warhol, 60 Artists, 50 Years. It showcases approximately 45 works by Warhol alongside 100 works by 60 other artists influenced by him. Joining me now are two of the curators of the exhibition, Mark Rosenthal and Marla Prather. Also with me are three of the artists featured in the show, Jeff Koons, John Curran, and my good friend Chuck Close. I am pleased to have all of them here at this table. So let me start with you, Mark. And somebody once said to me that great books begin with a question. Do great exhibitions begin with a question?
Well, that's what I hope. The question here is Andy Warhol the most impactful artist?
Impactful rather than important, rather than something
I prefer
else.
that. I prefer that because I think of his effect being like a meteor hitting the earth and changing climactic conditions, changing riverbeds, changing ways of working. And so influential is too hard a way to put it. If the topography changed in the art world because of Andy Warhol, and you as an artist came along 5 years later or 15 years later and started working in one of the multitude of ways an artist might work, you may not be thinking, well, did this start with Cezanne or Pollock or Warhol? You're just working in amongst the menu of ways that artists work.
Yes.
So,
Marla, how did you approach this?
Well, I think influence is a good word, actually, and I do think very different than asking the question, is he the most important artist of the last 50 years? Because with influence, we were really looking at what Mark suggested, really the influence throughout the culture, the impact of Warhol, sort of high, low, and everywhere. You know, when I said to a friend, an artist friend, a painter, that we were going to do a show about the influence of Warhol, she said, where do you begin? Warhol is everywhere. And Warhol is everywhere. And there wasn't a moment that the team at the Met sort of came to work in the morning and hadn't had some sort of experience that wasn't Warholian. You know, some ad we saw in a magazine, something on a subway, a tattoo of Marilyn, a T-shirt, the way that Warhol expanded the whole enterprise of art into movies, magazines, you know, television. And so I think the idea of influence is really important when we think about it, not just through sculpture and painting, but really throughout the culture at large.
Did it influence you, Chuck?
Well, the first thing I wanted to try and do was move away from him.
Yeah.
So if that's an influence.
It is an influence.
Yes. And, you know, he owned famous people, so I wasn't going to paint movie stars or anyone like that. And
so you painted your friends who became stars.
I know. They really screwed up my whole plan. Because the first people I painted were Phil Glass and Richard Serra. And, but, and the other thing was you know, Andy ultimately reduced everything to one squeegee stroke.
Yeah.
And I like to sit there for 4 or 5 months, building an image in a very different way. So certainly he kicked open the door, along with Alex Katz and a couple of other people, for an intelligent, forward-looking, modern portrait. Most people who were working with imagery were trying to breathe new life into 19th century issues. And he came along and said, we're going to make this of an entirely different order.
John?
My influence?
Yes.
Or my received influence? I think I was more reacting against Warhol. I must say I never enjoyed his influence in other artists except for the Germans like Polka and Richter, and I think those artists influenced me much more than Warhol directly, because I must say that I always found the attributes of Warhol like kind of unpleasant, like the idea of repetition just seemed repetitive and unpleasant, and especially the divorcing of the direct touch
Yeah.
I always found very hard to accept. I understand that it's the point of it, but I always found it just emotionally hard to accept for my own work. That's why I think I look to the Germans more.
Jeff?
I would think Andy's cultural heroes are also part of my cultural heroes. But I think that I've always been in awe of his existentialism, of just this going from Duchamp of indifference to acceptance, where, you know, it's so outward, and at the same time, you know, we're dealing with the self and the power of that, you know, existentialism. That's what
you decided to do. Was it 60 artists in 50 years? And you decided to draw 5 categories and see these particular segments of his work and other artists that have come flowing into that. Why that technique? Why that sort of architecture?
Well, it's a very large show, so you are dealing with 60 artists and 157 works, 51 of which are by Warhol. So we did need a way, I think, to sort of control...
To give order.
To give order, and those different thematic approaches were really Mark's idea, and really, I think, represent 5 of Warhol's kind of main contributions.
It's a way of organizing one's thoughts, because you're dealing with so much work.
But some artists, like Jeff, are represented in the show more than once. We have 4 works by Jeff Koons. We have 4 works by Gerhard Richter, several works by Polka, sometimes a single work like John and like Chuck, these iconic images. So sometimes artists are represented in different categories. So I think there's a kind of fluidity between these thematic sections, and they're not hard and fast.
He was first a commercial artist. Why did he come to New York, and how did he become an artist?
Well, he wanted to be
Always.
a so-called fine artist. Yeah. This was the old expression, which sounds so quaint now. He wanted to be a fine artist, but he arrived in New York virtually penniless, and he found he had a talent for commercial art, and he was enormously successful. But almost the whole time, he was dreaming of making it in the world of Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. This is what he wanted all along.
Did he always have a commercial sense?
Well, he talked about it a lot, but I think in the end he's an artist. He has aspirations that artists have. But I think
You paint because you want people to see your work.
But he exploded an awful lot of old traditions and old ideas. Preciousness, all kinds of things changed with Warhol, so that in 1966 he did an exhibition which there were no paintings. This is 4 years after his first exhibition. He took out an ad in the Village Voice saying, "I'll endorse anything, bring it to me." And he was producing the Velvet Underground. So he was really changing the conditions of artists' lives, I think.
You saw him, Chuck, right before he died, didn't you? Before he went to the hospital.
We were talking, and I was going to paint him, and he was going to paint me.
Yeah.
And he said, "I have to go in for this little operation. It's nothing much, and as soon as I get out." But
one of those roads not taken.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't going to give him one of my paintings for one of his.
Did he know that?
Yeah, no, I said so. I said, "I'll paint you, but I'm not going to give you one for..." Not that it wasn't valuable.
No, I know.
It takes too much trouble for me to make one of these things. But, you know, in terms of impactfulness, you know, Duchamp had tremendous impact.
Right.
And these people bend the course of art history because they were there. The most important people alter the direction things are going in. And he certainly did. Yeah. I remember when I was a kid, I saw my first Pollock, and I hated it, and because it challenged what I thought painting could be. And then I really wanted that rush again. I saw that, you know, I saw that rush in Frank Stoller's black paintings.
Yeah.
And then I saw it when I went in to see Andy's show that challenged...
You're seeing something I have not seen before.
Right. And often you react against it when you first see it.
Yeah.
But when you went into the old stable gallery and it looked like a supermarket storeroom with Brillo boxes and everything, you say, well, what the hell is going on here? Because there really hadn't been installation art. There hadn't been.
You were telling a story here beyond just showing the paintings. I mean, you interviewed the artist that might have been influenced. Why include that?
I think we thought from the beginning that the show wasn't just about Warhol, but it was about all of these other artists. And to the degree that it was possible, we wanted them to endorse the project or at least participate. And I tracked down as many artists as I could. I never made it to John Curran. There are obviously some artists who were deceased.
We found an interview.
There are artists who were deceased, but we even tried to include statements from artists that I wasn't able to get to. And I think it's really important to show, and it's very clear from just the comments we've heard already, the different approaches to Warhol and the sense of tension. Influence is a very slippery issue. I think it's a fraught issue with artists. Artists don't necessarily want to, say, I was influenced by someone, but artists do learn from other artists. And so I think the show is incredibly, I hope, nuanced and subtle about the kinds of relationships between Warhol and the idea that there's a kind of tension and the idea that John sort of approached Warhol through German artists and that there are kinds of cross-currents and that influence is, it can be outright appropriation, it can be parody, it can be theft, it can be all kinds of things. And so I really wanted the artists to be on the record in a very honest way about how they felt about this artist.
I mean, I think with someone of the stature of Warhol, there's also an Oedipal kind of path where even if you move away from him, you will end up meeting him and sort of finding that you do live in his world and you there's really no escaping him.
Right.
If in fact, I mean, this is a difficult question to ask, but if in fact he is not necessarily number one in terms of impact or influence or most important, who else is in the category of those people in the second half of the 20th century?
It's hard. It's hard. That's why you sort of keep coming back.
Yeah.
Chuck mentioned Duchamp, obviously, but one of the things that Warhol was remarkable for was, so he came along and did the Mona Lisa too, just the way Duchamp had done 50 years before. Warhol popularized a lot of things that hadn't been popular, like using photography. There had been photography around in painting, but very little.
So what was the reaction of at his time? I mean, when he was doing this, when he first did the Campbell soup cans, and when he first did these things,
well,
and so did the portraiture, and did
he became hated immediately, and he became unbelievably famous within just a couple of years. But one of the things that's fascinating to me is that a lot of the people who hated him were not artists. And I love to say that artists make art history, and artists started being touched by Warhol, no matter what anybody was saying.
He'd bend the curve.
I mean, Larry Bell, we have a quote from Larry Bell. Who would expect this in 1963 or 64 saying, Warhol's just changed everything. Larry Bell.
And I'd forgotten he died when he was only 58.
That's right.
I mean, so young.
Far too young.
Yeah, far too young. Let's take a look at some of these. The first one image is Andy Warhol's self-portrait in 1967. When we see this, what is it that, what made you include this? How do other people at this table respond to that? And this comes. Go ahead.
I mean, these introduced the show. There's two spectacular paintings from 1967 that were actually commissioned for Art Expo in Montreal, a kind of World's Fair, and they were stacked 6 high, so 4 more of them, very large, in a Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome.
Yes.
In a theme about a show thematically called Creative America. So they were very brightly colored, had to be seen from a large distance. But I feel that they have such a spectacular impact in terms of introducing the whole idea of the show, of regarding. He's regarding us. He was the great regarder, if you will. He was the voyeur. He was the receiver, and he is looking at us, but in this very enigmatic portrait where he's half covered in shadow, his hands in front of his face. In so many of his depictions, Warhol once said, "I paint myself to make sure I'm still here." And he was one of his favorite subjects, but often the face is obscured in some way. He's wearing sunglasses, he has his hands in front of his face, he's wearing a wig, he's wearing makeup. So it introduces Warhol, I think, in the best possible way.
And you can't go wrong with portraits.
Said from the master. Yeah. Let's see the next image.
Well, this is one of the images taken from a newspaper of a nose job, an ad for nose jobs.
Yeah.
And Warhol himself had a nose job, and he was obsessed by his own appearance. But this introduces a section of the exhibition having to do with the use of newspaper.
Yes.
And of course, artists had made use of newspaper, but nobody had made use of 5-foot images taken from the National Enquirer, the New York Daily News, no less, not the New York Times. That isn't where he went. He went to these sources of pop culture. And again, it's a lot like the self-portraits we just saw, where you have two images of the same person and you're forced to start thinking about camouflage, which is a very important theme for Warhol.
The next image.
Yeah, this is Ai Weiwei, and it's Neolithic vase with Coca-Cola logo. And one of the interesting things about Warhol's impact is how often artists took Warhol's example and turned it into something quite political. Really, it happened a lot in Warhol's art. And of course, with Ai Weiwei, it's as if to suggest that Chinese culture has been invaded by the Coca-Cola logo.
Yeah.
So the logo isn't just a matter of interest, it's a imperialist, colonialist image.
The next image.
That changed my mind about art, too.
Yeah, it did. How so?
Well, he had I think a way to present the banal in a very different way from Andy, and they were really difficult. I think really difficult pieces.
I think also you can't see in a photograph the terrifying aspect of that piece in particular, how bright it is, first of all, and it's actually kind of physically difficult to look at, and it's a vision of perfection that's captures the terror and a little bit the almost kind of ungodliness of perfection, and it's an amazing.
You liked it, Jeff?
Having heard all this?
You sat silent when we were looking at it.
But if I think back to Andy at the time, I was, thinking about, Andy's maybe the GE logos, maybe something like that. I was playing with Hoovers and the idea of the door-to-door salesman with the Hoovers. And there's a death-like aspect there, too.
I read where you talked about going door-to-door.
As a child.
And how as a child, and the experience of it, and how you would smell things, and you see the furniture, and you get a sense of what was going on.
A sense of acceptance of the environment, and I think of Andy's work in that way, of his experience. We're both from Pennsylvania, and so I always I feel a sense of that. But when I think of the work, again, it's this a complete kind of externalization, and of playing a very godlike situation. I mean, playing the creator of, you can multiply, you can procreate image after image, and at the same time you can have aspects of how we interpret images, of perfection, defined images into abstraction as life and death. And so they're so rich, this whole aspect of what it means to be alive, and a sense of our parameters of life take place in drama in his work.
This is?
Well, this is a disaster painting. Warhol did a number of these.
Orange Disaster.
Orange Disaster, and it's an electric chair In 1963, he was preparing for an exhibition in Paris, and he said, I'm going to call this show Death in America. But the image of death, the electric chair, is made kind of pretty in these electric chairs, but I think there's so much conflict or complexity to the prettiness of Warhol's banality. I think banality is really, John sort of hinted at it, I think there's something dangerous about banality in a lot of ways.
The electric chair was designed by Stickley.
Really.
Is that right?
It looks...
Art Deco furniture, Stickley?
Unbelievable.
That's why it's so good looking.
He was from Pennsylvania, too, was he not?
Another, I think so.
Thank you.
I think so.
That's amazing. How'd you know that?
Well, you know.
You know that. You know that.
My head is not crowded with a lot of other stuff, so some of that stuff sticks.
All right, the next image you'll all recognize. Here it is.
Well, Mark mentioned Death in America, and Warhol said quite clearly that his images of Marilyn belonged to the same series. And he only undertook the image of Marilyn the day she died in 1962. So his images of Marilyn, and this was the only image of Marilyn that he made something like 200 images of her, was really very much tied to this sense of morbidity and death that he felt was, as Mark said, the ultimate sort of banality that death surrounds us. And so he took to subject matter like Marilyn, like Jackie only after the assassination, Liz Taylor only after it was reported that she was dying on the set of Cleopatra. And so there is this kind of very...
Connection between portraits and death?
He was always concerned about death, his own mortality, and of course once he got shot. But Sidney and Francis Lewis gave their entire collection to the Virginia Museum, and they chartered a 727, and they filled it with all the artists. So there's Roy Lichtenstein, Jasper Johns, you name it. Everybody was in the plane. Every curator, every museum director, etc.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting between Andy and Philip Pearlstein.
Already.
Now, Philip Pearlstein went to Carnegie Mellon
Right.
with Andy, and they were, Philip and Dorothy came to New York first, and Andy lived on their floor for a considerable period of time while he's making the shoe ads and stuff. So I'm sitting looking at the flight and everybody in there, and I said, wow, if this plane went down, it would pretty much wipe out the art world as we know it. And Philip, who was competitive with Andy, said, yeah, and the Daily News would say, Andy Warhol and others die in a plane crash. But that was how important he was. He would have been Andy Warhol and others. Jasper Johns, a lot of people can argue is a more significant artist, but he wouldn't be the top.
So this is about fame in America?
It's about crossing over. Right. He had crossover appeal.
What was the reaction when you did when you pioneered what you were doing in terms of taking photographs and painting from photographs?
You mentioned photography. It's hard to remember, especially if you're as young as these guys, but weren't there. But there was such tremendous animosity towards using the photograph.
Really?
It was considered cheating. I even got spit on by other artists for using a photograph. Yeah.
By other artists?
Oh, yeah. The figurative artists.
Yeah.
The so-called eyeball realists.
A friend of mine was in art school in the early 60s, and he said the photography department was a lonely place. There was one teacher, nobody majoring in it. You felt contempt from
this was painted about
painters.
1969, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, 69.
68 or 9, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Take a look at this.
Well, Cindy is...
What's the direct link between Cindy and Andy?
Well, there's a lot of sort of pathways as an impact.
Yeah.
But this is the only one, I believe, that Cindy did that's actually based directly on a specific person, namely Marilyn Monroe. Yeah. But the whole sense of the appropriated image in Cindy's work, because 3/4 of the time you see an image by Cindy Sherman and you say, I know I've seen that movie. I know where that comes from. Yeah. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't.
Okay, the next one. What do you think of John?
Yeah. Well, I could add that these were from pornographic 70s porn from Denmark.
Right.
And I think, speaking of photography, one approach I had to getting over the guilt about using photography was to use pornography as a source, as a sort of keep the photograph at a something that's essentially photographic.
Yeah.
And I must say, I've always felt every artist, I think, never gets over the slight guilt of using. Maybe perhaps you have overcome that, but the guilt of using a photograph as a and I think that's a big part of Warhol's effect, is this kind of morbid, the way that the photographs are screened on in black. That's sort of like the corpse, and then the color is a kind of attempt to animate it.
Let me go into the five. These are the categories, I think. The Daily News, from banality to disaster, is one. Mm-hmm. The other, portraiture, which we can talk about, celebrity and power. Queer studies, shifting identities, consuming images, appropriation, abstraction, and surreality. And then No Boundaries, business, collaboration, and spectacle, which is the final section. Looks at another aspect of his life, which was in partnership in terms of other disciplines.
When everything exploded in a way in the 60s, by the time, I mean, he started making films in 63, a revolutionary.
He quit painting and said he wasn't going to make any more.
Right.
Yeah.
When exactly. It was
66.
giving up painting, was working with EAI, Experiments in Art and Technology. He was working with producing the Velvet Underground, Interview Magazine. He wanted his own television program. Yes. He was in advertisements, as Mark said.
He was on the Love Boat.
He was on the Love Boat.
How low can you go?
That's right. Yeah. He would sell his soul. So it's this idea of expanding an enterprise into many, many disciplines.
Yeah, he said famously, if you want to know all about Andy Warhol, just look at the surface of my paintings and films and me, and there I am. There is nothing behind it.
Well, but, that's something I think it's important with Warhol is the persona. I mean, there is something about the fame. He was obsessed with fame. He became famous, not just for the work that he made, but for the person that he was. Right. He was this strange, enigmatic person. There was the look, there was the social milieu, but he became a kind of cult figure in and of himself.
But here's what's interesting. This is another quote from him. I still care about people, but it would be much easier not to care. It's too hard to care. I don't want to get involved in other people's lives. I don't want to get too close. I don't like to touch things. That's why my work is so distant from myself.
He didn't like to be touched.
You never, I mean, I read a sense of you were never tempted to try to contact him.
Yeah, for some reason, I guess because a lot of other artists did want to interact with Andy, and they would go to the factory.
Right.
But I never, I just kind of stayed away.
Why?
I guess on the exploration of the ideas that I wanted to work with, I guess I felt that it was better just from a distance. But sometimes I would walk past the factory and I'd look up and maybe I'd see Andy at the window, and I'd be excited by that. Yeah. And I met him very superficially twice, and I enjoyed that a lot. But I guess the group that was at the factory at the time, and maybe it was even the work at the time, Charlie. I mean, maybe the Volkswagen paintings and some of the different images at that moment weren't the images I was most interested in.
What were the ups and what was the sort of journey of his career after he came to New York in terms of acceptance, magnification, then decline?
As I say, his first shows were in 1962.
Right.
One was in Los Angeles, one was in New York. By 1964, he had already showed in Paris. He had had another show in New York. And in the catalog, we have a section devoted to how quickly he became famous. And it was astounding speed by today's standards. But even during that time, people hated him and so forth. But just to jump far forward, in the 70s, there was a lot of questioning, even by the people who were interested in Warhol. Had he so sold out? I mean, what is left? He did endless commission portraits. There's a funny book on that subject, and it sounded like he was like a car dealer hammering his assistants to get commissions.
To what end?
Well, he loved money. I mean, he did love money, and he loved hanging out with the kings and the queens and all that sort of thing.
Those commission portraits look better and better.
Yeah.
But there's a divide, I think, with having been shot by Valerie Solanas in '68. I mean, that because there was then this period of hiatus. So there was a kind of apogee in the late '60s, and then there was the sort of demise of pop, and coincidental with that, Andy was pronounced dead. And really never fully recovered from that. And so there was a period. And then this style really changed as he began in the early 70s with commissioned portraits, and particularly with the Mao paintings.
Jeff, does this resonate with you? Pop art is about liking things.
Yes, you know, I think it's about embracing yourself and then going external. And, you know, being able to find a sense of confidence in the outside world and to share that with people, that they feel more confident about life. And so these the images are just kind of metaphors for the acceptance of what it means to be human, of other people. It's really not about these objects or these particular images, but it's just about that outside world, the acceptance of it. The vastness of it, you know.
Now, what were his skills?
It's a good question. I think, well, he had a fantastic drawing hand. It's a strange painting style. It always struck me it resembled more scrubbing and cleaning than a kind of lyrical French, arabesque. But that itself is incredibly profound in the context of his paintings. I think that I would add, though, that I think the influence of his mark has not been so great. When you see it imitated by other artists, I think it's always a downer, actually. So I think he was incredibly good at what he. I don't think he hid anything. There wasn't a special skill that he didn't show in his work.
Well, unlike de Kooning, say, who had 1 million imitators.
Right.
I mean,
Straight imitators.
Straight imitators.
Yeah.
There was really no way at that time to appropriate Andy. He was the appropriator, so it would just pass right through him to the original source.
Yeah, right.
And I think that made him more important, that it was not something that was going to be influential in that way.
Yeah. Mark, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Marla?
Thank you.
You very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Back in a moment. Stay with us.